Before the light came up over the ridge on the second Sunday of that terrible March, there was already a sound coming off the creek. A slow, wet thudding, 2 beats and a pause and 2 beats again. The sound of heavy wooden hammers falling on soaked cloth in a low stone house that everyone in the valley had walked past for 40 years and taken for a ruin. And the sound carried up the frozen road to the town before the roosters found their voices. And one by one the people came out onto their steps to listen to it in the dark. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, they were no longer on their steps. They were on the road. They came down the hill in the cold with their collars up and their hands pushed deep in their coats. And they came in wagons with the wheels ringing on the ruts that had frozen hard as iron in the night. And they came on foot leading children, who did not understand yet why their mothers were crying a little as they walked. And they gathered at the bottom of the hill where the lane turned off toward the creek, and they made a line. It was a long line. It went back past the burned sycamore and around the bend and out of sight, and every soul in it had come for the same thing. And not one of them, standing there in the wind with a hat in his hands, could have told you 3 years earlier that he would ever stand in a line at that woman's door for anything at all, unless it was to bring her a plate of food out of pity and to shake his head on the walk home. Inside the low stone house, out of the wind, a woman moved along a rope strung wall to wall, and she took the blankets down off it one by one where they had dried overnight, and she folded each one the way a person folds a thing they mean to keep, corner to corner, and then again, pressing the fold flat with the flat of her hand, and she counted them under her breath as she folded, which was a habit she had, counting things when there were people waiting, and she set them in a stack by the door in the order they would go out, and she did not once look through the little window at the line of them standing in the road. She had paid $15 for the whole of it. 180 fleeces, matted and moth-cut and stinking of the wet barn they had rotted in, condemned wool that a grown man had stood up in front of the county and called dead, sold to her off the back of a wagon for $15, because no one else in that country would give a copper cent for the lot. And they had laughed at her in the street when she did it, 7 months before, laughed openly, the whole market square, and she had walked out through the middle of it with her chin level and the bill of sale folded small in her fist. Remember that. $15, 180 fleeces, 7 months. What none of them shivering in that line understood yet, what they would understand before the day was out and would tell their grandchildren about until the telling wore smooth, was where those blankets had truly come from, and what stood down on the creek making that sound, and how a thing that had been left for dead and dug out of the silt with bare hands had come to be the only warm thing in a valley that was freezing, and why the fleeces they had all called ruined had never once, from the first day, been ruined at all. But that is the end of it, and the end will keep. To tell it right, you have to go back, past the March wind and the frozen line and the sound off the creek, back to a spring when she had nothing, and no one had a good word to say of her, and the stone house by the water was only a heap of stone that the willows had swallowed and the county had forgotten it ever built. The stone house was the whole of it, though no one knew that either, least of all her. It sat where it had always sat, on a shelf of rock beside Senate Creek, at the place where the water dropped and quickened, half a mile below the town and out of the sight and mind of everybody in it. And it had been a fulling mill once, in the years when the valley made its own cloth and had no other choice, and men had built it out of the creek's own stone, laid up without mortar, and fitted so close that the walls had stood through 80 winters without a hand laid to them. There was a wheel on the water side, or there had been, a great slow undershot wheel that the creek turned, and the wheel turned a shaft, and the shaft lifted 2 enormous wooden hammers that men in that country had called the stocks, and the stocks came down on the wet woven cloth over and over, hour on hour, with soap and with the creek water, and they beat the cloth and shrank it and closed it and thickened it until the weave disappeared into itself, and the thing that came out was not the loose flat cloth that went in, but something dense and felted and near to weatherproof, something that turned rain and held heat and lasted a lifetime, and that beating and closing and finishing of the cloth was called fulling, and the men who did it were called fullers, and it was old, old work, older than the town, older than the country. But the mills had come, the big brick mills downriver with their iron and their steam, that could full 100 yards of cloth in the time the old wheel took to do a single blanket. And the cloth they turned out was cheaper, and it was smoother, and it came in a wagon to the store already made, and one by one the little stone fulling mills up the creeks had gone quiet, and the men who knew them had died, and the valley had forgotten it ever needed such a thing. The wheel on Senate Creek had rotted and dropped into the water a piece at a time. The stocks had gone still. The roof had let the weather in at one corner, and the floor had silted up where the creek flooded every few springs and laid its mud down soft and even, and the willows had come in close and leaned their long hair over the walls, and the brush had grown up thick in the doorway, and inside, under the silt, under the leaves of 40 autumns, the two great stalks lay where they had stopped, and the stone trough stood full of black water, and the whole patient machine of it waited in the dark, the way a thing waits that has not been told how to stop. No one went there. Children were told the walls would fall. It was not on any map that mattered, and it was not in any living memory that counted, and it stood there below the town, 1/2 a mile and 40 years away, holding its breath. She would find it, but not yet. First she had to have a reason to be down on that creek at all, on her knees in the cold water with her sleeves rolled to the shoulder, and to have that reason she had first to lose everything, which she had already very nearly done, and to be laughed at in the square, which was still to come, and before any of it, a girl has to be set in her place, and her poverty named to the last dollar, because a precise account of what a person has is the truest thing you can say about them, truer than any word you could reach for. Go back then. Go back to that spring, 3 years before the frozen line and the sound off the creek, to the small rented house at the edge of the town, where Ada Corliss owned exactly what she owned and not one thing more. She was 23 years old. She had buried her husband the autumn before, and her father the winter before that, the one of a fever that came up the valley in the wet, and the other of the long, slow going that takes a man's breath a little at a time. And she had buried them out of the same box of money, and it had emptied the box. And now she owned a 2-room house that she did not own but rented by the month from the man Teague who kept the store, and she owned the furniture in it, which was a bed, and a table, and 2 chairs, and a chest, and her mother's spinning wheel that no one in the town had used in a working way for 20 years, and she owned a loom. The loom was the thing. It was a great 4-post floor loom of oak that had been her grandmother's and her mother's after her, and it filled the whole back room, and it had sat idle and dressed with a half-finished web of gray for 3 years, because there had been no call for handcloth in the valley since Ada was a girl, since the store had begun to bring the bolt goods up from the mills, and a woman who could weave was a woman who could do a thing nobody paid for anymore, the way a woman might be able to read Latin. She owned the loom, and she owned 4 sacks of picked wool her mother had left, and she owned a debt. The debt was to Teague, at the store, and it stood at $11 and some cents, and it climbed a little every month with the rent and the flour and the lamp oil, and it was the kind of debt that a woman alone in that country did not climb out of, only slid down further into. And Teague was not a cruel man, and that was the trouble, because a cruel man you can hate cleanly. But Teague would let her run the account and mark it in his book with a soft, sad face and ask after her the way you ask after the sick, and every month the number in his book got bigger, and every month his face got sadder, and the number and the face together were a kind of quiet drowning. She owned no land. She owned no animals, not a cow, not a hog, not a hen. She had sold the cow to bury her husband. She owned 2 dresses, one of them black, and a good pair of boots she had resoled herself with leather begged from the harness maker, and a Bible with 3 generations of Corliss births and deaths set down in the front of it in 3 different hands, and that was the sum of her, laid out plain, at 23, in the spring 3 years before the county came to her door. No money and no standing, and no name that opened anything, and the town had decided about her, as towns do, all together and without a meeting, and what it had decided was worse than scorn, because the town did not scorn Ada Corliss. It pitied her. Scorn a person and you have at least granted them the strength to be blamed. You have said they did a thing and must answer for it, but pity takes even that away. Pity folds a person up small and sets them on a shelf and says, poor thing, nothing to be done. And the town said it about Ada with real feeling. The women especially, the kindest of them, who would stop her in the road and hold both her hands and look into her face with their heads tilted and tell her she was in their prayers, and that the Lord did not send more than a body could bear, and then walk on and say to one another that it was a shame. A young thing like that, no people left and no prospects, and that great useless loom taking up half the house, and that somebody ought to see she got a plate of something warm before the winter, and they meant every word of it, and every word of it was a stone laid on her chest, because there was a thing about Ada that the town could not see and did not think to count. And it was the whole of the story, and it was this. She watched, and she remembered, and she kept the account. Where another person's eyes slid off a thing, hers stayed. She had been the kind of child who could tell you a week later which ewe had thrown which lamb and what the weather had done the day they sheared, and she had grown into the kind of woman who, handed a tangle, did not throw up her hands but sat down with it and found the one end that would pull, and she counted, always. Under stress and under grief, she counted the panes in a window and the boards in a floor and the beats of a clock, and the town looked at that quiet in her and called it sadness, or called it slowness, and pitied her for it, and never once understood that they were looking at the one thing in that valley that was going to matter. She kept a book, not a diary of feelings, she had no patience for that, but a ledger, a plain cloth-bound ledger she had kept since she was 15, and in it she set down what things were and what they cost, and where they came from, and what became of them, and she meant to keep it until she died, and it was the truest habit she had, and no one but her had ever seen a page of it. The town saw a poor pitiable widow with a useless loom. It did not see the ledger. That was its whole mistake, and it would take 3 years and a killing winter to pay for it. The wool came into the story the way trouble comes, all at once and out of a wet spring. The valley was a sheep country, had always been. The whole upper end of it, the long green benches above the creek carrying flocks that a dozen families ran the way their fathers had, and the wool of it went out every year in the summer down to the buyers at the river, and the wool was the money that carried those families from one year into the next, the way a crop carries a farmer, and in the ordinary run of things it was good wool, long and sound and clean enough, and the buyers took it and the families lived.
But the year before, Ada bought her fleeces. The spring came in wrong. It came in cold, and it came in wet, and it would not quit. Week after week of a gray driving rain that stood the creek up out of its banks twice, and rotted the new grass in the low ground, and kept the flocks huddled and miserable. And when at last there came a false break in the weather, the men sheared, because the shearer had come round on his circuit, and would not come again, and the sheep could not carry the wool through the heat that everyone swore was coming, and so they sheared into that brief false dry, and they bagged the wool and they stored it, and then the rain came back. It came back and it settled in, and the wool sat in the barns in the sacks, and wool that goes up damp and is packed away. Damp does a thing that ruins it. It heats. It heats from the inside like a wet haystack. It sweats, and it warms, and it mats. The fibers lock and caught together into a dense grabbing, felt that no comb will open, and in the dark and the damp, the moth got into it. Besides, laid into the folds of it, and the young of the moth ate their channels through it, and cut the fibers short, and by the end of that bad wet summer, the whole clip of the upper valley, near everything the families had to sell, had heated and matted and moth-cut in the barns, and it stank, and it came apart in the hand in wet felted chunks, and when the buyer came up from the river and put his hand into the first sack, he took it out again and wiped it on his coat and said one word, which was dead, and he would not make a bid. And here is the lineage of it, the part the town never let itself look at square, because it is easier to call a thing ruined by God's weather than to look at the man who profited by the ruin. The buyer who came up and put his hand in the sack and said dead and drove off without a bid was a factor, a middleman, and the house he factored for was the house of Harlan Cruz, and Cruz had bought the valley's wool for 11 years. And Cruz knew wool the way a doctor knows a wound, knew exactly what heated cotted wool was, and exactly what it was not, knew that it was hurt wool and not dead wool, knew that under the felt and the smell, there were fibers still sound in their thousands if a body had the patience to find them, and knew above all that a whole valley of frightened men with debts at the store and nothing else to sell would take whatever they were offered for a thing they had been told was worthless.
So he had his man call it dead. He let the word go around. He let it sit through the fall, let the families sweat, let the store accounts climb, and he meant, when they were desperate enough, to come back in the spring and buy the whole ruined clip for pennies and ship it down to a shoddy mill that would tear it and card it and blend it and turn it into cheap cloth and make him a great deal of money, and there was nothing in the law against any of it, and it very nearly happened just that way. Every conventional road out was closed. The families could not sell it, could not use it, could not full it or spin it in any quantity that mattered, could not even easily be rid of it. It was a barn full of stink and debt, and it was going, everyone agreed, to be burned. And the burning was set, by common consent, for a Saturday in the 9th month, at the old sale yard behind the square, where the ruined lot would be offered once, for form's sake, to any fool who wanted it, and then carted off and put to the torch. Ada Corliss was at that sale. She had come to sell her mother's 4 sacks of picked wool for whatever they would bring against the debt at the store, and she stood at the back of the yard in her black dress with the money for the sacks knotted in her handkerchief, and she watched the auctioneer, the man Ford, work through the small lots, and then Ford came to the ruined clip, the whole 180 fleeces of it stacked on 2 wagons and roped down, and the smell of it reached the back of the yard, and Ford did not so much sell it as apologize for it. He said the county wanted shut of it. He said any man could have the lot and welcome, that it was going to the fire otherwise, and he asked, half laughing already, who would give him $1, and no one spoke, and he asked who would give him 50 cents, and the men looked at their boots, and somebody near the front said burn it, and there was a laugh, and Ada Corliss walked up the middle of the yard. She had counted it already, is the thing. Standing at the back, she had done the sum that no one else had bothered to do, because the fleeces were only trouble to them, and she had looked at them and seen 180 of something, and she had thought, in her plain counting way, that even ruined a fleece is 3 or 4 pounds of wool, and 180 of them is 500 or 600 pounds, and if 1 pound and 10 came sound out of it, that was 50 pounds of wool, and 50 pounds of wool, spun and woven by a hand that would sit still long enough, was cloth, and cloth was money, and she had that whole ledger of arithmetic run out in her head before she ever left the back rail. So she walked up through the yard, and she said, in the plain, steady voice she had spent 3 years of grief learning to keep level, that she would give $15 for the lot. It was every cent she had knotted in the handkerchief, the whole price of her mother's 4 good sacks, and the yard went quiet for the length of a breath, and then it laughed. It laughed the way a crowd laughs when it is relieved to have something to laugh at, big and loud and rolling, and the men slapped their legs, and Ford asked her twice was she sure, was she certain, because there were no returns on a thing that was going to the fire, and she said she was sure. She paid her $15 to the clerk, and she watched him write it in the day's book, and she made him write it plain, sold outright, the whole condemned lot, to Ada Corliss, for cash in hand, and she watched the ink dry, and she took her copy of it, and she folded it small, corner to corner and again, and she put it away inside her dress against her breast, the way you put away a thing you mean to keep. And she arranged with a boy to haul the wagons down to her house, and she walked out through the middle of the laughing yard with her chin level and did not answer any part of it, and her saying nothing was the only answer she gave, and it was answer enough. There was an old man at the edge of the yard who did not laugh. He was called Tam, Old Tam, Tam Sowerby, and he had come across the water 40 years before, from a wool country on the far side of the sea, where the winters were long, and the people were poor, and had made their cloth by hand for 1,000 years, because there had never been any other way, and he had worked the fulling stocks himself as a boy, on a stone mill on a cold river, with the same soap and the same water and the same patient beating, and he had come to this valley and found no call for the one skill he had, and had lived at the far edge of the town on nothing much for 40 years, mending harness and minding other men's sheep, and the town paid him about as much mind as it paid the stone house on the creek, which is to say none. He watched Ada Corliss pay her $15 and fold her paper and walk out through the laughter, and when she passed near him he said a thing to her, quietly, not for the yard, and he did not mock her, and it was the first sentence anyone in that whole town had spoken to her without pity or scorn in it in 3 years. He had a lock of the ruined wool in his hand. He had pulled it off the wagon as it passed, a filthy matted knot of it gray with barn dirt, and he was working it slowly between his thumb and his first finger as he spoke, rolling it and rubbing it, and where his thumb worked, the dirt fell away and a few fibers came loose and stood up clean and long and bright as new, and he held it out a little toward her so she could see it, and he said, "No fleece is so far gone that a patient hand cannot bring it back." That was all. He said it plain, the way you would say the sun would come up, and he went on rubbing the lock between his thumb and finger, and Ada Corliss looked at the clean fibers standing up out of the dirt where his thumb had been, and she took the lock of wool from him, And she did the same thing with her own thumb, and she felt the sound fiber come up under the filth, and she put that lock too, away inside her dress next to the folded paper, and she went home to her 180 ruined fleeces, and she began. What she began was slow, and it was filthy, and it was the kind of work that has no shortcut in it and never has had, and it went on for 2 years before it made her a single dollar. And to understand what she did, you have to understand that a fleece is not one thing but many, and that the ruin was not even in all of it, and that the whole of her method was patience broken down into steps so small that each one on its own looked like nothing. She began by skirting. She took each fleece and she spread it out on a table she had scrubbed, and she went over the whole of it and she cut away and threw out the parts past saving, the dung-locked tags and the felted mats too hard to open, and the moth-cut ends gone to powder, and she was ruthless about it. She threw out half of some fleeces and more, and she kept only the wool that would still, when she worked it in her fingers, come open into sound fiber, and she set that sound wool aside, and she wrote in her ledger, every day, how many pounds she had skirted and how many she had thrown, so that she always knew to the pound exactly where she stood, and no one had ever kept such an account of that wool, because no one had ever believed there was anything in it to count. Then she washed it. She could not wash 600 pounds of greasy matted wool in a kettle in the house, so she took it down to Senate Creek, where the water ran cold and clean and steady, half a mile below the town at the place where the creek dropped and quickened, and she found a slack pool below the drop, and she knelt at the edge of it with her sleeves rolled to the shoulder, and she washed the wool a few pounds at a time in nets she made of old sacking, pressing it and never wringing it, working the barn dirt and the grease out of it in the cold running water until it came clean. And she laid it on the willows to dry, and the willows for 100 yards along that creek went white with drying wool through 2 summers, and the town, when it noticed it all, shook its heads and said the poor Corliss girl had taken to washing rotten wool in the creek like a mad thing, and pitied her the more. She scoured, and she picked, going through the clean dry wool a lock at a time to pull out the last of the moth-cut and the burrs, and she teased it, and she carded it, drawing it again and again between the wire teeth of her mother's cards until the fibers all lay one way, soft and open and light, all the ruin combed out of it, and only the sound long fiber left, and out of a filthy matted fleece that a grown man had called dead, she would get, at the end of a day's work, a small basket of carded wool, as clean and bright as any that ever came off a living sheep, and she would weigh it and write it down, and then she spun. Night after night at her mother's wheel, the wheel the town had thought as useless as she was, she spun the carded wool into yarn, hour on hour, the wheel humming its one low note in the lamplight while the town slept. And she spun a sound-even thread, because her hands had learned it as a girl, and because she would not let a slub or a thin place past. And she filled bobbin after bobbin and skein after skein, and hung them on the wall of the back room around the great loom. And it took her the better part of that first winter to spin the wool of the first 24 fleeces, and she wrote in the ledger the weight of every skein. And when she had yarn enough, she dressed the loom, warped it a thread at a time, a labor of days by itself, hundreds of ends drawn through the heddles and the reed, without one crossed or missed, and then she wove, and the loom that had stood silent for 20 years began again to make its old sound, the thump of the beater, and the knock of the shuttle, and the tread of the treadles, all night, and out of it came cloth, plain honest wool cloth off the ruined clip, yard by slow yard. But cloth off the loom is not yet a blanket, and here is where the method turned from patience into something the valley had truly forgotten. Cloth off the loom is loose and open and thin, the weave showing through, and it will not turn weather, and it will not truly hold heat. And to make it do those things, it must be fulled, beaten wet with soap until it shrinks into itself and closes and thickens and felts, and there was no way on this earth for a woman kneeling by a creek to full a heavy blanket by hand, no way to beat it enough or long enough or hard enough, and she knew it, and it stopped her cold at the end of the first year, with a stack of good thin cloth she could not finish. And it was in going up and down that creek looking for a stone flat enough and a fall of water strong enough to help her beat the cloth, walking the bank in the low water of a dry autumn, that she came on the heap of stone under the willows that the town called a ruin, and pushed the brush away from the doorway and went in, and stood in the cool green dark with the creek talking through the wall, and saw, under 40 years of silt and leaves, the shapes of two great wooden hammers lying still in a stone trough, and understood, slowly, the way she understood everything, exactly what she was looking at. She had found the fulling mill. She did not know its name at first, only that it was a machine for beating cloth with water, which was precisely the thing she had been kneeling in the creek wishing for, and she went and got old Tam, because old Tam was the only soul in that country who might know. And old Tam came down the creek on his stiff legs and stood in the doorway of the stone house, and did not say anything for a long time. And then he told her what it was, and how it had worked, the wheel and the shaft and the stocks and the troughs and the soap and the water, and that he had worked its like as a boy across the sea, and that it was old, old work, and that if the walls still stood and the stone troughs held, there was no reason under heaven it could not stand and work again. And the two of them, the pitied widow and the forgotten old foreigner, set about to raise it. They dug the silt out of it by the barrow-load through a whole spring. They cut the willows back and let the light in. Tam shaped a new wheel out of oak over a winter, spoke by spoke, and they hung it on the old iron gudgeons that had never rusted through, and they mended the shaft, and they dressed the great stocks and set them true. And one gray morning in the second autumn, Ada Corliss lifted the gate and let the creek onto the wheel. And the wheel turned, slow and enormous, 40 years of stillness turning over into motion, and the shaft turned, and the stocks rose and fell, thud and thud, on the wet cloth in the trough, and the sound of it went up the creek toward the town for the first time in the memory of anyone living. And Ada stood in the doorway with the creek water cold around her boots and watched the loose thin cloth of her ruined fleeces beat itself dense and close and thick and warm hour by hour, and become, at last, a blanket, and she wrote in the ledger the date and the weight and nothing else, because there were no words in her for the rest of it. The first finished blanket was the thing that could not be argued with. She brought it up to the town in the second winter, not to sell yet, but because it was cold, and old Tam was old and lived on nothing at the edge of things. And she carried it to his cabin and put it on his bed, and Tam slept warm under the wool of the ruined clip he had first rubbed clean between his thumb and finger. And word of that got around the way small things do. And one or two came and put their hands on that blanket and felt the weight and the closeness of it and knew, being sheep people themselves, that they were feeling something no bolt of millcloth from the store had ever been or could be, a blanket that would turn rain off a man's back and hold his heat through a night on the ground, a blanket a body could bury a father in or carry a child to church in and hand down after, and the pity in the town began, very quietly, to curdle into something else, into an unease, a doing of sums, a memory of a laughing yard, and it was exactly then, exactly when the first undeniable thing had come off that creek, that the smooth man came to Ada's door. Harlan Cruz came in a good coat, in a covered buggy, with a clerk and a leather case, on a fair afternoon in the early part of that second winter. And he was all warmth and regret and Christian concern. And he took off his hat at her door and he called her Mrs. Corliss, and he was so sorry for her losses. And he came in and sat at her table and admired the loom, and admired the blanket folded on the chest, ran his hand over it slowly and said it was fine work, remarkable work, and then he opened his leather case and laid his papers on her table and began, gently, to talk. And he talked for a long time, because talking was the thing Harlan Cruz did instead of listening, and it was going to cost him everything. He told her the wool of that clip had been bought and paid for. He said it kindly, sadly, as a thing he wished were otherwise. He said the whole of the Valley's clip that year had stood under a standing agreement with his house, a wool agreement the families had all signed years back, that consigned the season's wool to Cruz to sell on their behalf. And that title to the wool never passed to the growers nor to any buyer, but rested always in his house until it was sold at the river, and that the county had no right to sell that ruined lot to her at all, that the sale was void, that the wool and anything made of it were, in law and in sad fact, his. And he was sorry. He was so sorry, but the law was the law. And then, because he was a decent man, he said he would not leave her with nothing after all her labor. He would buy the blankets from her. He named a price. It was a low price, a pitying price, a few dollars, and he pushed a printed paper across the table for her to make her mark on, and he warned her, gently, folding his hands, that if she would not take his fair offer and sign, she would be put to law, and a widow put to law is a widow ruined, and he would so hate to see it, A young woman with no people and no means, ruined over a barn full of rotten wool. She had not said 10 words the whole time he talked. She had sat still and level and let him run on, the way you let weather run that is deciding whether to turn bad. And she was doing what she always did. She was watching and she was counting, and she was keeping the account, and she caught the thing he let slip because she caught everything. Because in the middle of his gentle talking, laying out how sorry he was, Harlan Cruz had said one sentence too many. He had leaned toward the folded blanket and he had said, warmly, that he had watched her carry this through with real admiration, that he had followed it from the start, that he had known the day she gave her $15 for those 180 fleeces, that there was more in that clip than the county had the wit to see, and he smiled when he said it. A smile meant to flatter her, and he did not understand what he had done. Ada Corliss understood. She understood that a man does not follow from the start and know to the dollar and the head count a thing he believes is worthless. She understood that the wool had never been dead, that he had always known it was not dead, that he had called it dead on purpose, and let a valley of families think it ruined so that he could come and take it cheap, and that everything he had just said about title and agreements was the same trick worn a second time, the same smooth talking, the same paper, and that the only thing he had that she did not was words, and words were the one thing that had never once frightened her. She said very little. She said she would think on his offer. She said it in her plain level voice, and she showed him nothing, and Harlan Cruz took her quiet for a widow's fear, and put his papers away well pleased, and said he would call again in a week for her answer, and he put on his hat and went out to his buggy in the good coat, certain he had won, and that certainty was the whole of his ruin, because he had left her a week, and a week is a very long time to a woman who keeps the account. She did not spend the week weeping, and she did not spend it running to lawyers she could not pay. She spent it with her ledger, and with the folded paper she had carried against her breast for 2 years. And when Harlan Cruz came back in his good coat and sat again at her table and asked, gently, for her answer and her mark, she gave him her answer, and it was not loud, and it was not long, and it beat him into the ground. She laid the folded bill of sale on the table between them, and she opened it out flat, the paper the clerk had written in the day's book at the yard, and she had made him write plain, sold outright, the whole condemned lot, to Ada Corliss, for cash in hand, $15, and dated and signed by the auctioneer and the county clerk both. And she laid her own ledger beside it, open, where she had set down that same day the $15 paid and the 180 fleeces received, and every pound skirted and thrown and washed and carded and spun and woven and fulled in the 2 years since, the whole patient account of it in her own plain hand. And she said, quietly, that the county had not sold her the wool under his agreement, but had condemned it and struck it off its books as dead and burned wool, and sold what was left for salvage, outright, for cash, before witnesses, and that his agreement was for the sound clip a house consigns and sells, and had never in 11 years covered a lot the county itself had declared dead and ordered to the fire, and that he could not have it both ways, could not call the wool dead in the fall to buy it cheap, and call it his good consigned clip in the winter to take it back, because it was written down, in the county's own book and in hers, which it was and which it had been, all along. And she said one thing more, the shortest thing she said, and it was the only hard thing, and she said it looking straight at him. You told me you knew. That was all. You told me you knew. And Harlan Cruz, who had said too much and could not now unsay it, who had confessed in his own smooth voice that he had known from the first day the wool was worth having, sat with his low offer and his printed paper gone worthless in front of him, and there was nothing in the case to answer her with, because you cannot take a fact to law, and the fact had been on the table since the day of the sale, folded small against a widow's breast, waiting. He gathered his papers slowly. He did not raise his voice. He put on his hat, and he said something about revisiting the matter, and he went out to his buggy, and he did not come back. And within the month it was known that Harlan Cruz had given up his rounds in the Upper Valley, and by the spring, he had left the county altogether and gone down to the river towns, and the valley never saw him again, and that was the end of him, and no blow was ever struck. Then came the winter that turned the whole thing over, and made it a thing the valley would tell forever, and it came the 3rd year, and it was a killing winter, the hardest in 50 years. Everyone said so afterward, and the old ones said it while it was happening. It came early, and it came without mercy. The cold set in before the leaves were fully down, and it did not break. Week after week of it. And then the great snow came in the middle of it and shut the roads. And then the cold came harder on top of the snow, and the river froze so the mills downstream could not run, and the goods could not come up, and the store's shelves went bare of the cheap mill blankets and the bolt cloth that the valley had leaned on for a generation. And it did not matter that they were bare, because those thin mill goods had never been made to turn a winter like this one, and families that had traded away their old ways for cheap warm enough found out in the dark of that January exactly how much cheap enough was worth when the temperature dropped past anything a store blanket was built for, and children took sick in cold beds, and old people died in the night of nothing but the cold, 2 of them in 1 week, and the whole valley, that had pitied Ada Corliss and laughed at her in the yard, turned in its fear and its need, and remembered the one warm thing anyone had seen in 3 years, remembered the blanket on old Tam's bed that turned rain and held heat like nothing off a mill, remembered the sound off the creek, and they came down the hill to her door. And she had them. That was the thing the town had never counted on and could never have counted on, because they had never looked in the ledger and never watched her count. For 3 years, all through the labor and the washing in the creek and the raising of the stone mill, Ada Corliss had been making blankets and folding them and stacking them by the wall, dozens of them, and then more than dozens, out of a clip of 180 fleeces that yielded far more sound wool than any of them had believed was in it. And she had a store of warmth laid by in that little house against exactly the kind of need she could not have named but had, in her patient way, prepared for. And when the killing winter came and the valley came to her door, she was ready. And here is the part that matters more than the warmth. Here is where the story turns from clever to something better. She did not gouge them. She could have. A woman with the only warm blankets in a freezing valley could have named any price and had it. Could have taken back in one hard winter every ounce of the pity and the laughter with interest, and no one would have blamed her, and it would have been a smaller story. She did not do it. She set a fair price, a true price, the honest worth of a blanket that had taken that much wool, and that many hours, and that many years, and she set it and did not move off it, not up for the desperate and not down for the pitiful. One fair price, because she was no fool, and a thing given away is a thing counted as worthless, and she would not have her work counted worthless ever again, by anybody. And to those who came to her door with nothing at all, with no money and no goods, and only the cold behind them and children in it, she gave a blanket anyway, and set the price down in her ledger against their name, and shook their hand on it, credit on a handshake, to be paid when the spring came, and the year turned and they were able. And she wrote each one down plain, the name and the sum and the date, and every single one of those handshake debts was paid before the next winter. Every one. Because people do not forget the hand that was open to them in the killing dark, and that ledger of fair prices and kept handshakes was the truest wealth that ever came into that valley. And it did not make her rich in money, though it made her comfortable at last. It made her something the valley had no word for that was better than rich. So come back now to the frozen line, the one we started at, the second Sunday of that terrible March, the sound of the stalks coming off the creek before the light, and the people gathered at the bottom of the hill with their hats in their hands. Now you know what the sound was. It was the fulling mill, the stone house on Senate Creek that had held its breath for 40 years, working again, beating the last of the winter's cloth into blankets. Now you know why they stood in line. The same people who had laughed in the yard, standing in the cold with their hats off. And it was not only for the warmth, though it was for the warmth. It was that a body cannot stand in a line at the door of someone it wronged, and be kept warm by the very thing it mocked, and keep its hat on its head. It is not in people to do it. The hat comes off on its own. And now you know the arithmetic, the sum that ran under the whole of it like the creek under the mill. $15 for 180 fleeces. That is 8 cents a fleece. Not quite 8 cents a fleece, laughed at in a market square, carted home stinking in September, and by the 3rd March it was the warmth of a whole valley, and the life of more than one child in it, and the woman who did the arithmetic that no one else would do, stood inside folding blankets and counting them under her breath, and did not look out the window at the line, because she had never once done any of it for the line. And she closed every account, in the years that came after, the way she closed the account of the wool, plainly and to the last entry. Old Tam Sowerby, who had rubbed the first lock clean between his thumb and finger, and given her the one true sentence anyone had given her, She took into a warm room at the back of a good house, when his legs would carry him no more, and she kept him in wool and in company to the end of his long life, and he died old and warm and content under a blanket of the ruined clip, and she wrote his death in the front of the Corliss Bible in her own hand, though he was no blood of hers, because he was, by then, more her people than her blood had ever been. And there was a child, a girl called Sari, half-orphaned in that first bad year when the wet spring took her father, a grave, quiet girl who had come down to the creek out of hunger and curiosity in the second summer, and stayed, and Ada had taught her, the skirting and the washing and the carding and the spinning and the weaving and the working of the stocks, and had given her the keeping of the ledger, the actual writing of it, when her own eyes began at last to go, and Sari grew up with the whole of the method in her hands, and the whole of the account in her book, and when Ada was old, it was Sari who ran the mill on Senate Creek, and Sari's children who learned it after, so that the knowledge did not die with the woman who found it, but went on down the valley, the way the creek went on, and Harlan Cruz was gone and forgotten, and no one spoke his name, and the loom went on knocking, and the stocks went on beating, year after year after year, and Ada Corliss grew old in the warmth she had made, and was content. And when she was very old, older than old Tam had been, sitting one autumn afternoon on a bench in the sun by the door of the stone mill, with the creek talking through the wall behind her, and the stocks thudding their slow 2 beats and a pause and 2 beats again, a young woman came down the lane, who had come from somewhere else and had nothing, thin and proud and frightened under the pride, the way Ada herself had once been, come to ask after work or after wool, and she stood there twisting her hands and half ashamed to ask, and Ada Corliss reached down into the basket beside the bench, where the raw wool waited to go to the creek, and she took up a lock of it, a filthy matted knot gray with barn dirt, ruined-looking, worthless-looking, the very picture of a thing no one would give a copper for, and she began to work it slowly between her thumb and her first finger, rolling it and rubbing it, the way old Tam had done it in the yard 50 years before, and the dirt fell away, and the fibers came up clean and long and bright as new where her thumb had been, and she held it out a little toward the frightened young woman so she could see, and she said the only thing there was to say, the thing that had been waiting in her to be said since the day it was first said to her, and she said it plain, the way you would say the sun would come up. No fleece is so far gone that a patient hand cannot bring it back. And she went on rubbing the lock between her thumb and finger, and behind her the creek ran on over the wheel, and the wheel turned, and the stalks rose and fell, thud and thud, on and on down the years, and it was still going when she stopped speaking, and it did not stop.